I am the famous American. And I have a question for you. Can you agree with my theory, my concept here, that the band R.E.M. is technically a Southern band? What does that even mean, a Southern band? When we think of R.E.M., we think of a band that is from Athens, Georgia, a college band. That's how they got their following, was college radio. We know this. Their first album, Murmur, 1983. And I've even said this too. In the 50s, you had Elvis. In the 60s, you had the Beatles. In the 70s, you had Led Zeppelin. And then by the 80s, who took over as far as defining that general sound of that decade? I would tell you that it was ultimately shared the stage between R.E.M. and U2. That's what I would tell you. And they both started, at the beginning of the decade. Again, 1983 for R.E.M. But that's how I see it. But it's interesting, R.E.M. sound is not specifically a Southern sound. It doesn't really resemble country music at all. It is interesting, they will throw in instruments that you don't hear often, like the mandolin. We know that about Losing My Religion. That's interesting. If I'm not mistaken, it was the first major hit that had a mandolin in it in pop rock music. But as far as a Southern sound, not so much. As far as the things, the topics in the song, even then it doesn't resemble country music at all. However, here's the technicality. They use Southern expression. So like Losing My Religion, one of their most famous songs, is a Southern expression. Even when you look at, was it Sitting Still from their 1983 album Murmur, he's talking about Katie Bar the Door. You have to be from the South to even know what that means or have even heard of it. So when we look at what makes music, well, it's not just the sound of it, it's also the words too. So even if they're not talking about more Southern culture, because even Tom Petty, being from Florida, from time to time, he would actually have songs that talked about the South. He even had an album called Southern Accents. But R.E.M. never really leaned into that, other than certain phrases that are known for coming from the South, that if you're not from here, it's like, what is he even saying? And it's interesting too, because the band members themselves weren't necessarily born and raised in the South. From what I have looked up about Michael Stipe, is that his father was in the military, so he kind of grew up all around. He just happened to be a young adult when the band formed in Georgia, and that's where they started. So what do you think? Do you think that technically R.E.M. is a Southern band? After all, they formed there, they made it big there, and their lyrics, even Fables of Construction from the 1985 album, apparently is also full of these Southern expressions. So I always think it's interesting, because when a musician is from the South, we often expect them to have Southern style music. Of course, there's plenty of exceptions to the rules. I mean, Britney Spears and Justin Timberlake would be obvious examples right then and there. And then there's others like Tom Petty. You may not even have known that he was from the South, but he's definitely from Florida, and he brings it up a lot if you're a fan of deep tracks of his, like I am. I love anything from Tom Petty. But if you listen to Tom Petty and Bruce Springsteen, which they're two of my favorites, what you'll find is they kind of sound the same. The sound of their music is very similar, and even the way they pronunciate is pretty similar. Yet, very famously, Bruce Springsteen is from New Jersey. Meanwhile, Tom Petty from the South in Florida. So I think that's interesting, because sometimes you can tell that a person is from a certain region of the United States just from their music. But R.E.M., it's so subtle, you wouldn't know. You'd have to probably be told that. Maybe you could figure that with Tom Petty. He's pretty folksy. But then again, so is Bruce Springsteen. I think this is interesting and fascinating. Let's talk about it some more. Why don't you leave a comment, and maybe that'll inspire me to make a new video to further unpack this concept. I am the famous American.